Does anti-Zionism necessarily lead to anti-Semitism? Israel's war on Gaza has often led to a conflation of the two terms. But how misleading could this be? And does it mean anyone criticising Israel's actions in Gaza is anti-Semitic? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. So, Israel's war on Gaza has increased both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism worldwide. While neither term is new, anyone who criticises Israel for its actions in Gaza is often labelled as anti-Semitic. Israeli leaders in particular have conflated condemnation of the response to the Hamas-led attacks on October the 7th as both anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. Analysts argue that blurring the difference helps Israel undermine any opposition to or rejection of its policies. Israel is accused of weaponising the two terms to justify its attacks on Gaza and other Palestinian territories. But with no end in sight to the conflicts in the Middle East, what are the dangers of and the fallout from confusing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? We'll hear from our guests in just a moment, but first, this report from Alex Baird.
Is anti-Zionism the latest form of anti-Semitism? The US House of Representatives passed a resolution in December saying, clearly and firmly, that it is. Anti-Zionism is widely described as the opposition to Zionism, a nationalist ideology that helped establish the State of Israel in 1948. It contends that Jewish people have a right to self-determination in historic Palestine, which Zionists view as their ancestral homeland, despite the Palestinians already living there. Its expansion in the late 19th century was partly in response to anti-Semitism in Europe. Many hardline Zionists argue that the Palestinian territories of the occupied West Bank and Gaza also belong to Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has maintained that to be opposed to both Zionism and the State of Israel is inherently anti-Jewish, a claim he made once again at the United Nations General Assembly last month.
The singling out of the one and only Jewish state continues to be a moral stain on the United Nations. It has made this once respected institution contemptible in the eyes of decent people everywhere.
But many Palestinians reject Zionism as the driver of settler colonialism that dispossessed them of their lands during the founding of Israel. The Nakba, or catastrophe, in 1948 saw Zionist military forces violently driving around 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. But many Jews have also spoken out against Zionism. Ultra-Orthodox groups have regularly protested against the State of Israel and its ongoing occupation of Palestinian lands. In spite of the debate, there's been a steep rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia worldwide since October the 7th last year. Recorded anti-Semitic incidents in the United States increased 388% in the 4 weeks after October 7, while the number of Islamophobic incidents increased 216% during the same period. That led US Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who's Jewish, to deliver this warning.
Anti-Semites are taking advantage of the pro-Palestinian movement to espouse hatred and bigotry towards Jewish people. But rather than call out this dangerous behavior for what it is, we see so many of our friends and fellow citizens, particularly young people who yearn for justice, unknowingly aiding and abetting their cause.
Although the debate about anti-Zionism has raged for decades, Israel's war on Gaza has made it an increasingly bitter argument with more violent consequences. Consequences that strike at the heart of the idea of Israel and its very right to exist. Alex Baird, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
All right, let's get into this. Let's bring in our guest from London. We are joined by Giovanni Fassina, who is the Executive Director of the European Legal Support Centre, which deals with definitions of anti-Semitism. In New York, we have Ariel Angel, who's the Editor-in-Chief of Jewish Currents, which is an award-winning magazine founded in 1946 and has long covered anti-Semitism and its weaponization. And in Cambridge, in Massachusetts, in the United States, is Omar Bartov, who's the Samuel Pisa Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start in New York, if that's all right with you, Ariel. Let's get straight to the nub of this. Is to be anti-Zionist anti-Semitic?
Thanks for having me. Well, Judaism is a religion. Zionism is an ideology. They are two separate things. So anti-Zionism is not necessarily anti-Semitism. The problem is that many Jewish people are raised to believe that Zionism is an identity that is fused with their Judaism, and that's where the confusion comes in. We have been told in other social movements that we need to listen to people talking about their experiences and listen to them when they tell that they are experiencing a kind of oppression. What is difficult about this is that Jews really feel that their identity is being challenged when Zionism is being challenged. And for people who are not Zionists, it's very clear that they are challenging the ideology of Zionism. So there is a lot of confusion. I will say that Judaism existed long before Zionism, and many anti-Zionist Jews out there have been trying to reclaim a Jewish tradition that is not reliant on Zionism. But in the United States and certainly in Israel, Zionism has, in a sense, animated most of the major institutions and institutional life. And so that is very, very difficult to start to separate those things out. And that also adds to the confusion. What I'll also say is that anti-Semitism does exist in our movements for Palestine and in anti-Zionist movements. But that is true of every ism that exists in every movement,
Sure.
Racism, sexism, homophobia. And of course, because this is a movement where Jews are the perpetrators in Palestine as Israeli Jewish citizens, we have to be extra on guard. And part of the problem with confusing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is that we've drained anti-Semitism of meaning to some extent.
Okay,
it becomes much, much harder to confront.
Okay, thanks, Ariel. Omar, so you have a deep understanding of the history here, of course, and as you have observed these dreadful events of the past 12 months, what is your sense about this question over whether being critical of the Zionist project equates to being anti-Semitic, and how the framing of that question, if you like, has changed over the past year?
Yeah, well, also, thanks for having me. Look, there is obviously a certain rise in anti-Semitism. One has to observe it. One can say, however, that that depends to some extent on how one defines anti-Semitism. We know that the ADL, for instance, the Anti-Defamation League, has actually changed its definition of anti-Semitism to include also protests against Israeli actions. And so part of the rise is also a matter of how you define the phenomenon itself. There has been anti-Jewish animus for a very long time, and modern anti-Semitism is a creation of the late 19th century. And that is a phenomenon that is certainly alive and dangerous. But I would say that what we have seen this year, but actually going back a couple of decades, is that the State of Israel in particular has used a particular definition of anti-Semitism, which tries to conflate criticism of policies of the state, which most people would find indefensible, with anti-Semitism, which most people would also oppose. And therefore, it is in part a response to Israeli policies that have been a push to Germany and the United States and other countries to understand anti-Semitism as criticism of Israeli policies. we should add that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world who are either anti-Zionist or a-Zionists, who have no particular love for Zionism, they don't oppose it, and they don't endorse it. Certainly large communities of Orthodox Jews, including in Israel itself, who are not Zionist and are certainly not anti-Semitic. In fact, they see themselves as the epitome of what Jewish identity is. So in large part, this is a political exercise. And I would add one last thing, an unfortunate finding, that Israeli actions, particularly in the last year, have contributed to the rise of anti-Semitism simply because they have acted so violently against Palestinians.
Giovanni, this confusion that Ariel talks of between the terms, would you say that it has been taken advantage of, that there is this intentional conflation of the two terms that then creates antagonism against those who support the Palestinian cause?
Yes, definitely yes, but it's not just my opinion. There are leading Jewish scholars like Anthony Lerman that in his book, Whatever Happened to Anti-Semitism, clearly explain how especially the development of the IHRA definition has been used to deliberately conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And then, of course, and I'm going to talk more about this later, it is deliberate because when this conflation takes place, then it's way easier to crack down on people who are speaking out in support for Palestine. And what Anthony Lerman explained in his book, it clearly shows how specific groups in Israel, pro-Israeli organizations, together with experts on anti-Semitism studies, have been pushing for years, from around 2010, have been doing a huge advocacy effort to reshape anti-Semitism and to conflate the two terms.
And Ariel, so as Omar was alluding to, there's been another strand to this, how someone who may not be necessarily anti-Zionist, but is critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, and even this is being implied as anti-Semitic, and that's something you've observed, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Jewish establishment groups in the United States, certainly, and I know globally, will not miss an opportunity to accuse somebody criticizing Israel of anti-Semitism. I think where it becomes very tricky, as Omar said, is that particularly, for example, in the student movement that we saw on college campuses, you have these encampments where anti-Zionist Jewish students are very, very involved and perhaps at the core of some of the organizing. And so it becomes a lot more difficult to level that accusation. Now, certainly it is leveled, and there is a way in the Jewish community of telling particularly young Jews, because 40% of Jews under 44, by a number of different polls, we know that many of those young people identify either as anti-Zionist or, as Omer said, a-Zionist, non-Zionist. It becomes very, very difficult to tell them that they're anti-Semitic, and yet still they are being pushed out. They're called, self-hating Jews, accused of being capos, which is a very upsetting slur. So indeed, there is an effort to marginalize those Jews and to kind of tell them that they are not really a part of the community.
Okay. Giovanni, as you know well, there is this working definition of anti-Semitism which has been accepted by the US State Department and by other governments around the world, and it's been framed, of course, by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Tell us a little bit about that and why it's controversial.
Well, it's controversial for two main reasons. The first one is that this definition comes with examples, and there are two examples that are being constantly used to crack down on advocates for Palestinian rights. The first example is example 7, that says that denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor is anti-Semitic. Okay? So and the other example says that applying double standards by requiring Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation is anti-Semitic. So basically, what's been happening is that this definition in Europe has been is in theory non-legally binding. So have been adopted by public bodies such as universities, governments, but also private companies as just an internal policies. But in the last 5 years, we provided legal support to hundreds of people who have been disciplined and sanctioned because of this definition, which shows that de facto this definition is actually used as a law. And this is extremely, extremely problematic.
Okay, and Omar, it said the IHRA muzzles the legitimate criticism of Israel's human rights record. Is that how you would perceive it?
Yeah, look, this as it's called, the IRA definition, which goes back to 2000 to an important meeting that took place in Stockholm, which initially was about Europe remembering and commemorating the Holocaust, which was a highly laudable idea. But this definition has had a growing chilling effect on opinion in general and on legitimate criticism of Israeli policy specifically. What is sort of curious about this whole thing, and this has happened a great deal in the United States this year, is that the term anti-Semitism has been used to muzzle opinion. It has been used in a kind of McCarthyist way, as the Red Scare was used in the past. So people at the university, students who are simply outraged by what they are seeing being done with the help of American taxpayers, are being disciplined for stating their opinion and described as anti-Semitic. And as was said here, of course, quite a number of them are Jews. I've also had the honor of being called a capo in various emails that I received. The other terrible effect is that this kind of definition of anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism has fractured the Jewish community itself. It is having an effect of actually putting large numbers of Jews who believe in, even those who believe in the right of the state of Israel to exist but are appalled by its policies, outside of the mainstream of the Jewish community. And that is a tragic effect of Israeli policies and of the adoption of this definition.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that a little bit further, Ariel. What are you seeing in terms of that demographic change and what that long-term impact might be?
It's a good question. Certainly, there is a demographic change generationally, as I mentioned. The numbers of identification with Zionism are much, much higher among people, 50 and over. Certainly, younger people who have never grown up with Israel as a kind of weak country. All they see is what Israel is now. And they want no part of it. I think this is tearing apart families. At Jewish Currents, we opened up our phone lines for people who were having rifts within their families and got hundreds and hundreds of calls, heartbreaking stories of, parents essentially choosing their Zionism over their children in some cases. And so these are very, very deep rifts. I think what it will be interesting to see is whether the anti-Zionist or non-Zionist community in the Jewish community can create new institutions to hold Jewish life and thereby sort of rejoin the Jewish community on their own terms. Because right now, for example, we're in the middle of the high holidays. There is nowhere in most places in the United States for anti-Zionist Jews to go to services. Nowhere where there isn't an Israeli flag on the bima, on the stage for the holidays. And so that's a very, very distressing prospect for anti-Zionist Jews who want to stay connected to Jewish life.
Okay, and Giovanni, tell us a little bit more about the cases that you've worked on where the definition of anti-Semitism, as put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, we were discussing a little bit earlier, has been used and then disputed?
Yeah, like I can tell you a bit more. So some of the cases we've been working on in England and in Germany. Like in England, the definition has been adopted by universities, and we have been working on at least 25, 30 cases where academics and students were put under disciplinary investigation because of what they posted on social media. They posted pro-Palestine content on social media. And after the university adopted the IHRA definitions, these people were received a complaint against them, alleging that their social media posts were violating the IHRA definitions and therefore were anti-Semitic. In another case in England, was really, really astonishing. A young Muslim woman was offered a job in a public body, and after doing the last check, their employer said that her social media posts were anti-Semitic according to the IHRA definition, and so therefore they withdrew the job offer. The good side of the story here is that in all these cases, we managed to push back. So because of the legal support, this woman got her work, and all the cases against academics and students were dismissed. But this took a huge amount of time and energy. The other major issue here in Germany, and we should have a specific program only for that, perhaps, where the IHRA definition is adopted by groups that monitor anti-Semitism, and these groups train police and train public officials. So if people have been wondering why also the police has been so aggressive in Germany over the last 10 months against protesters, there's a clear connection here. But also just again, I could speak for hours, but 1 year ago, during the Nakba commemoration, in 2022, was prohibited by the police. And the police referred clearly to the IHRA definitions, saying that the demonstration was likely to produce a highly anti-Israel and anti-Semitic atmosphere in the light of the IHRA. So these are just
interesting.
Few examples.
Giovanni, thanks for that. We just needed to push it on a little bit. So Ariel, as you listen to that, I mean, I know you're not surprised by what you're hearing from London there about these various cases that have been going on. But what happens, do you think, if Israel continues in this direction?
Well, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not going to answer your question because I think it's important actually to bring this to the American context. In the American context, we see very much the same thing, but we also see IHRA being written into all kinds of other laws, including hate crime laws. IHRA is also being used now in the Department of Education, and they are attempting investigations into a number of schools. Student protest is going to be cracked down on this year extremely hard. And I think that we're almost not prepared for the amount of repression. In the United States, a right-wing movement against the universities has sort of hijacked the cause of anti-Semitism. And in fact, what we are going to see is the academy dismantled, free speech curtailed, and protests curtailed on the back of the idea of anti-Semitism, which is a fully right-wing project, but American liberals seem to be fully on board. So that's something that we have to look forward to and that we will really have to guard against.
Okay, sure. So pressures are growing. Omar, I'll ask you the question. What's your sense of what's going to happen in the long term if this persists?
So, just to continue what Ariel was just saying, one thing that I really worry about, the origins of anti-Semitism were always conservative and then right-wing and fascist. They've never been the left. And so using the left as the source of what is defined as anti-Semitism is basically a trick to legitimize then crackdown on liberal communities And the result of that is actually going to be a real rise in anti-Semitism from its true sources, which are the right and the conservatives. And there is a fair amount of rich resources for anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe. So what we see here is that I think parts of the academic establishment in the United States, the intellectual establishment, and the Jewish establishment in the United States are playing into the hands of the actual sources of anti-Semitism. And what worries me most is that there is a sense, or a sense will be created, that there's a muzzling of criticism of Israel by Jewish interests in the United States, and that will have the boomerang effect of right-wing anti-Semitic interests in America and in Europe, using the old canard that Israel and the Jews are controlling politics and finance. This is a real danger that I don't think people are facing up to. The ADL itself, the Anti-Defamation League itself, is playing into that. So I think that is a real danger. And we see where what is happening in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France, the rise of the real right-wing Islamophobic and anti-Semitic nationalist xenophobic elements. And we see that, of course, in the United States, too. And they will play directly into this.
Omar, we're running out of time. So I'd like to come back to you, Ariel, finally, if I could. So what needs to happen here? It's all heading in the wrong direction. There are pressures from all ends. What needs to happen?
It depends where. I mean, within the Jewish community, I think that we have incredible infrastructure for education, and we need to repurpose some of that education to give Jewish communities the ability to confront the Nakba in particular, to be able to understand what happened to Palestinians and to approach even if they remain Zionist on some level, to approach their experience of their own Zionism, also from the perspective of its victims, as Edward Said said. So that is something I would really like to see, and that I think I will see generationally as things shift. If we're looking at, for example, the United States government, I think that they have a responsibility as they think about how to fight anti-Semitism to integrate the perspectives of Jewish voices who are not in the mainstream and who are not Zionist, particularly because that represents a full 30% of the community overall. And I think that we need to be on guard against anti-Semitism in our movements, precisely for the reasons that Omar said.
Okay, Ariel, I'm going to have to jump in there. I do apologize, but we have run out of time. Very important subject, but we do need to move on. But thanks to all of you for contributing to this and this important conversation. Giovanni, Fassina, Ariel Angel, and Omar Bartov, thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again at any time by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, of course, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.